1962, deep beneath the Atlantic Ocean, a Soviet submarine was shaking violently in complete darkness. American warships above were dropping depth charges. The explosions were rocking the submarine from all sides. Instruments were failing. The emergency red lighting was on. The crew had been out of radio contact with Moscow for days. They were sweating in the cramped hole, exhausted and terrified, and they believed with complete certainty that nuclear war had already started above them. The submarine commander made his decision. He would launch the nuclear torpedo. On this submarine, 3 officers needed to agree before a nuclear weapon could be fired. 2 officers said yes immediately. 1 man raised his hand and said no. His name was Vasily Arkhipov. He was the 2nd captain of Soviet submarine B-59. He argued calmly and firmly that they could not be certain that war had actually started, that they had to surface and attempt to contact Moscow before making a decision that could never be undone. His 2 colleagues argued back. The commander was furious, but Arkhipov would not move. Slowly, reluctantly, they backed down. The submarine surfaced peacefully among the American warships. Every person alive on Earth today exists because of that one decision. Because 1 man in a submarine said no. This is the story of Cuba, the small Caribbean island that has been at the center of world history for over 500 years. The island that brought humanity closer to nuclear destruction than any other single event in recorded history. The island that in 2026 is once again surrounded by American warships. Its hospitals running out of medicine. Its fuel stations running dry. While a Russian oil tanker crosses the Atlantic Ocean toward it and American naval vessels track its every movement. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes. And the rhyme that Cuba keeps producing is the most dangerous rhyme in modern history. To understand why this small island matters so much, why it has always mattered so much, you need to start with geography. Cuba is the largest island in the Caribbean Sea. It sits 90 miles south of the Florida coast. That is not very far. A fast boat can cross that water in a few hours. A missile can cross it in minutes. That proximity, 90 miles of open water between the island and the American mainland, made Cuba the most strategically sensitive piece of real estate in American foreign policy from the moment America became a serious power in the Western Hemisphere. Christopher Columbus arrived in Cuba in October 1492. He was looking for India, and he found the Caribbean instead. When he saw the green tropical coastline and the indigenous Taino people watching from the shore, he wrote in his journal that this was the most beautiful land human eyes had ever seen. Spain claimed the island. For the next 4 centuries, Cuba was a Spanish colony. Sugar plantations worked by enslaved people made Cuba extraordinarily profitable. Everything that wealth produced went to Spain. The Cuban people, both the indigenous population, which was largely destroyed by disease and conquest within a century, and the enslaved Africans brought to work the plantations, received nothing. By the late 1800s, a Cuban independence movement had been building for years. America watched with great interest. An island 90 miles from American soil, controlled by a declining European power, producing enormous agricultural wealth. This was a situation America found increasingly uncomfortable. America began encouraging the Cuban independence fighters. American officials told the Cubans, "We do not want your land. We only want to free you from Spain." In 1898, the United States Congress passed the Teller Amendment, formally promising that America would not occupy Cuba once Spain was driven out. The Cubans believed that promise. They fought fiercely. With American support, they drove the Spanish out. Cuban independence appeared to have arrived. Then in 1901, the United States Congress passed the Platt Amendment. The Platt Amendment gave America the legal right to intervene in Cuba's internal politics at any time it chose. It gave America the right to maintain a permanent naval base at Guantanamo Bay on the southeastern tip of Cuba. Cuban leaders read the terms with expressions of absolute betrayal. The promise of genuine independence had been broken before it could even properly begin. The Teller Amendment had said America would not occupy Cuba. The Platt Amendment ensured that America effectively controlled Cuba without needing to formally occupy it. Cuba became officially independent in 1902, but the real control remained American. American companies moved quickly into Cuban sugar mills, coffee plantations, casino operations, and tourist infrastructure. A series of Cuban presidents served American business interests with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Then in 1933, Fulgencio Batista took power and served those interests completely and without embarrassment. Under Batista, American businessmen controlled most of Cuba's productive economy. The Mafia, American organized crime, ran the Havana casino operations openly and profitably. Havana became a playground for wealthy Americans. Luxury hotels and gambling dens operated freely. The most famous cigars in the world were sold to tourists who had no idea what ordinary Cuban life looked like. An ordinary Cuban life looked like unemployment, poverty, and political repression. Cuban workers watched their country's wealth flow to foreign hands, while Batista's military suppressed anyone who spoke against the arrangement. The anger that built over those decades produced one of the most remarkable revolutionary careers in 20th century history. Fidel Castro was a young Cuban lawyer who had tried legal and political routes to change and found them all blocked. He turned to armed revolution. In 1956, he landed in eastern Cuba with a small group of fighters and retreated to the Sierra Maestra Mountains. He launched a guerrilla campaign, small attacks, ambushes, building support among rural Cubans who had everything to gain from change and nothing to lose. Ordinary Cuban peasants and workers brought food, information, and recruits. Batista's conventional military forces found themselves fighting an enemy that moved like water through the countryside. By the end of 1958, Batista's position was collapsing. On New Year's night, 1959, he received word that Castro's forces were at the gates. He gathered his closest associates, loaded what he could, boarded a plane in the middle of the night, and fled to the Dominican Republic. He never returned to Cuba. The 25 years of American-backed rule ended in a single midnight flight. On January 8, 1959, Fidel Castro entered Havana. Hundreds of thousands of Cubans flooded the streets in genuine celebration. A man who had fought in the mountains for years was now walking through the capital. It was the most remarkable political transformation in Cuban history. Castro moved quickly. His government nationalized all American banks and factories in Cuba. American company representatives received the news with expressions of shock and fury and were forced to leave overnight. Cuban workers watched the American businessmen go with considerable satisfaction. American President Eisenhower received his briefing about the nationalizations and immediately ordered the CIA to do something about Fidel Castro. What followed was one of the most extraordinary covert operations in American history. The CIA assembled 1,500 Cuban exiles who were loyal to the old Batista order. They were trained in secret camps in Central America. They were given American weapons and organized into a force called Brigade 256 Quant. American B-26 bombers were painted with Cuban Air Force markings so that American involvement could be denied. The plan was to land on Cuban beaches at night, trigger a popular uprising against Castro, and remove him from power, all while making it appear to be an internal Cuban rebellion. The operation launched on April 17, 1961. Brigade 256 landed on the beaches of the Bay of Pigs at night. Within minutes, local Cuban fishermen spotted the invasion force and alerted the army. Castro was informed immediately and mobilized his forces with calm and decisive efficiency. Cuban military arrived in overwhelming numbers. The disguised American aircraft were shot down. More than 1,400 Brigade 256 fighters were captured. When the prisoners were presented before Cuban and world press, the disguised aircraft wreckage displayed alongside them. America's covert involvement was completely and humiliatingly exposed. President Kennedy stood before the press and took full personal responsibility. It was America's most embarrassing military failure of the entire Cold War. Kennedy privately threatened to shatter the CIA into 1,000 pieces. The failure of the Bay of Pigs did not discourage further American efforts. It intensified them. The CIA launched Operation Mongoose, a comprehensive program to destroy Cuba's economy through sabotage and to eliminate Fidel Castro personally. Cuban sugarcane fields were burned, factories were sabotaged, power plants were targeted. Fake radio stations broadcast propaganda against Castro, and the personal assassination attempts began in earnest. The CIA tried to kill Fidel Castro 650 times. Poisoned cigars were prepared. A poisoned diving suit was arranged. Exploding seashells were planned. Bombs were hidden inside microphones. Women were trained and sent as honey traps. The American mafia was approached and asked to help. Every single attempt failed. Castro survived them all. The Guinness World Records lists it as the highest number of assassination attempts on any leader in human history. 650 by one government, against one man. Over 50 years. Each failed attempt and each CIA sabotage operation pushed Cuba more firmly into Soviet arms. Nikita Khrushchev publicly backed Castro and expressed strong Soviet support for revolutionary Cuba. The Soviet-Cuban relationship deepened rapidly through 1960 and 1961. Meanwhile, America had secretly installed Jupiter nuclear missiles in Turkey and Italy, both pointing eastward toward Soviet cities. When Soviet intelligence discovered this, Khrushchev made a calculation that seemed to him perfectly symmetrical. If America can place nuclear missiles near Soviet borders, the Soviet Union can place nuclear missiles near American borders. In the summer of 1962, Soviet cargo ships began arriving at Cuban ports at night. Under cover of darkness, Soviet military personnel unloaded covered equipment and moved it through the Cuban countryside to secret installation sites. Soviet SS-4 medium-range ballistic nuclear missiles were being assembled 90 miles from the American coast. The operation was called Anadir. Soviet soldiers had been issued winter uniforms before departure to disguise their tropical destination. The secrecy was extraordinary, but it was not enough. On October 14, 1962, an American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft flying at extreme altitude photographed the installation sites from above. The photographs were rushed back for development. CIA analysts working through the night identified the unmistakable shape of Soviet SS-4 ballistic missile equipment under construction. Nuclear weapons capable of hitting most major American cities were being assembled in Cuba. The following morning, National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy carried the classified photographs to the presidential quarters and woke President Kennedy. Kennedy studied the images in silence. He understood immediately what he was looking at and what it meant. The most dangerous 13 days in human history had begun. Kennedy assembled his executive committee, the ExComm, a group of senior government, military, and intelligence officials who met in secret to advise him. Military commanders pushed hard for immediate airstrikes on the Cuban missile sites followed by a full invasion. They believed decisive military action was the only appropriate response. Diplomatic advisors argued for a naval blockade, a quarantine that would stop Soviet ships from delivering additional military supplies while keeping open the possibility of negotiation. Kennedy chose the blockade. On October 22, 1962, he addressed the American people on live national television from the Oval Office. He announced the discovery of the Soviet missiles. He announced the naval quarantine of Cuba. He warned the Soviet Union directly that any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation, the Western Hemisphere, would be considered an attack on the United States by the Soviet Union, requiring a full retaliatory response. American warships took position across the Atlantic in a blockade line stretching hundreds of miles. Soviet cargo ships loaded with additional military supplies were approaching from the east. The two fleets were closing the distance. The entire world watched and waited. Then the Soviet ships slowed and stopped and turned around. American Secretary of State Dean Rusk watched from the State Department and said quietly, "We are eyeball to eyeball." And I think the other fellow just blinked. The immediate naval confrontation was avoided, but the missiles already in Cuba remained. The crisis was far from over. October 27, 1962 was the single most dangerous day in human history. 3 separate crises occurred simultaneously. An American U-2 spy plane accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace over Siberia, and Soviet MiG fighters scrambled to intercept it. A separate American U-2 flying over Cuba was shot down by a Soviet surface-to-air missile and crashed on Cuban territory deep beneath the Atlantic Ocean. Soviet submarine B-59 was enduring the experience that opened this story. Depth charges exploding, instruments failing, radio contact with Moscow lost, the crew believing nuclear war had started, and a commander reaching for the authorization to launch a nuclear torpedo. Vasily Arkhipov said no. The submarine surfaced. The world continued. The crisis was resolved through a combination of public diplomacy and secret back-channel negotiation. Robert Kennedy met secretly with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin. A deal was constructed. Khrushchev announced on Soviet radio that the Soviet Union would remove its missiles from Cuba. America publicly promised not to invade Cuba. In a secret agreement that was not disclosed to the public for decades, America quietly removed its Jupiter missiles from Turkey within the following month. Both sides saved face publicly. Both sides had actually compromised. The deal that ended the most dangerous crisis in human history was built on each side, getting something they needed while telling their own people they had won. The missiles left Cuba, but Cuba remained firmly in the Soviet orbit, and America maintained its economic blockade. The pattern that would define the next 6 decades was set in 1962, and it has not fundamentally changed since. Soviet cargo ships arrived regularly at Cuban ports through the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, bringing oil, machinery, food, and technical expertise. Cuba paid with sugar. The barter relationship kept Cuba's economy functioning for 30 years. Then in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. The Soviet flag came down from the Kremlin, and the Russian flag went up in its place. The subsidies that had kept Cuba functioning stopped overnight. Cuba entered what became known as the Special Period, the most difficult decade in its modern history. Food rationing, bicycles replacing cars as fuel ran out, power cuts lasting 16 hours a day, hospitals struggling without basic medicines. The Cuban economy lost approximately 35% of its output in a single year. Fidel Castro governed Cuba through all of it. Through the Bay of Pigs. Through the missile crisis. Through the Soviet collapse, through decade after decade of American blockade, he ruled for 50 years, the longest-serving non-royal head of government of the 20th century. In 2008, clearly in declining health, he handed power to his brother Raul. In April 2016, he gave his final major public address at the Communist Party Congress. My hour will come like everyone's comes, but the ideas of Cuban communists will remain. In November 2016, Fidel Castro died at 90 years old. Cuban Americans in Miami celebrated in the streets. In Havana, reactions were quieter, more complicated, more personal. In 2015, Presidents Obama and Raul Castro shook hands and restored diplomatic relations. American tourists arrived in Cuba for the first time in decades. The streets of Havana briefly filled with something that felt like cautious hope. Then the Trump administration reversed the entire opening. New sanctions. New travel restrictions. The brief window closed. The cycle of isolation reimposed itself as if the opening had never happened. The COVID pandemic then eliminated Cuba's tourism economy entirely. Fuel shortages intensified. Power outages stretched to 10 and 16 hours daily. In July 2021, the largest public protest since 1959 erupted across Cuba. Ordinary people in the streets of Havana and other cities chanting for food, for medicine, for electricity, for something different. The Cuban government responded. The images went around the world. Cuba now has a new president, Miguel Díaz-Canel, not a Castro for the first time since 1959. He inherited the same blockade, the same economic pressures, the same fuel and medicine shortages, and the same fundamental geopolitical situation that has persisted for 6 decades. He is the new face of a very old problem. And in 2026, the situation has reached another critical point. America has surrounded Cuba with warships from all 4 sides, the most comprehensive naval blockade since 1962. Cuban hospitals are running out of medicine. Cuban fuel stations have run dry. Cuban power infrastructure is failing across the island. Ordinary Cuban families are managing without electricity for most of every day. Cuba has made an emergency request to Moscow. Russia has responded immediately. A large oil tanker has departed and is crossing the Atlantic toward Cuba. American naval vessels are monitoring its course with weapons systems active. The United Nations Security Council is in emergency session. The world is watching the same Caribbean Sea that the world watched in 1962. The Russian tanker crosses the Atlantic. American warships watch. Cuba waits. The question that has haunted this island since 1898, since America promised one thing and did another, remains unanswered. Will this island ever be simply left alone to determine its own future? Or will it always be a piece on other nations' geopolitical chessboards, its people paying the human price of decisions made in Washington and Moscow? The sugarcane is still growing in the Cuban countryside. The extraordinary 1950s American cars are still running on Havana streets, kept alive through 65 years of mechanical ingenuity, because no new American cars could be imported after 1962. The music that no blockade could contain is still playing. Cuba endures. And somewhere, in whatever room the critical decision about the Russian tanker is being made, the most important question of the entire crisis is being asked silently by everyone who remembers 1962. Is there a Vasily Arkhipov in that room?